Hello, I'm Judge Peggy Hora, retired from the California Superior Court, and I'm also president of Justice Speakers Institute. It's my pleasure to be with you today, and what I want to talk about is the role of alcohol and other drugs in crime, recidivism rates, and how we can best respond to it. About 90% of all crime is directly related to alcohol or other drugs. Clearly, offenses like impaired driving by alcohol or other drugs, things like domestic violence, where alcohol or other drugs is involved over 93% of the time on the part of the perpetrator and over 50% of the time on the part of the victim or survivor. And other crimes, property crimes to get the money to buy drugs and so forth. So it's very much something we have to deal with in the criminal justice system that before 20 years ago, we didn't do a very good job of. Now we can look at conditions for release from custody for people who are accused of committing these crimes. We can look at conditions of probation after they are convicted. And we can look at specialty courts like DWI courts, driving while impaired courts. And we have to look at what are we trying to do, what are we trying to accomplish by these conditions and rules of courts and so forth. First of all, what we're going for with the high-risk, high-need offender is sobriety, abstinence. There's no such thing as drinking sensibly if you're an alcoholic. If someone is arrested for driving under the influence for the first time, about 75% of those people will never come back in the system. So you don't want to go full bore and put all these conditions on them that they don't need. They made a big mistake, they are aware of it, and they'll never do it again. Just the arrest itself will be enough to stop them from recidivating. However, that 25%, that hardcore, alcoholic, high-risk, high-need offender, you have to stop from drinking. And some people say, oh, it's the driving that's the problem if we just stop them from driving and take away their driver's license. Well, oh, if only that were true. About 75% of people who have their license suspended continue to drive. So taking away their license doesn't do it. We really have to get to the root of the problem, which is the alcohol or other drugs. So we tell them abstinence. We tell them that they'll be tested. We tell them that they will be monitored. And how do we do this? When you drink alcohol or take other drugs, it goes into your system and gets metabolized and eventually dissipates. It goes away. With alcohol, it has a very high rate of dissipation. It really doesn't take that long to rid most of your system of the alcohol. And it does that at a predictable rate. So we know exactly how much alcohol is being burned off each hour. So if you take the blood alcohol content of someone, it's called a BAC, you can use mathematics to figure out when they'll be completely alcohol-free. You can also go backwards to find out what the BAC was at the time they were driving, if it were 3 or 4 hours ago. Mostly that's measured by breath, and everybody's seen, at least on television, somebody blowing into the little tube. Now there's two kinds of breath tests. One is out in the field, and it's merely a field sobriety test to confirm that alcohol is present, and it's called a PAS, P-A-S, preliminary alcohol screen. The other is BAC and a full-blown breath test that's on a scientific machine that's been proven to be credible in court, that is maintained properly, that is calibrated on a regular basis, and so forth. So the breath is one way to measure these things, and the thing that we're doing, and it's a fairly new phenomenon, is called ignition interlock devices. And that's essentially requiring the high-risk, high-need offender to install an IID on their car. And what they have to do is blow into the machine It's essentially a breath test. And if they show alcohol, the car won't start. So the breath is measuring, the machine is measuring the alcohol in the breath and responding by refusing to start. 48 states have laws around ignition interlock devices, and some require the installation of such a device even on first offenders. I don't happen to think that's a good idea. I think that's overly broad, but that's the law in some states nonetheless. California is in the process of studying it right now. But for the high-risk offender, it's absolutely marvelous. Recidivism is reduced between 35 and 75% when you have that device on. They have to blow into it in order to start the car, and if alcohol is present, they can't do it. The trick is, however, when you're dealing with this high-risk, high-need offender, if that's all you're doing, if you're not doing evidence-based treatment along with it, the rates go right back up to their very high rates the second they take off the ignition interlock device, because they haven't made any internal changes. They haven't come to grips with their alcoholism, and so you're safer when it's on, but once it's off, you know, they just drive like maniacs, and they do. So ignition interlocks have gotten better and better. Some require a photo now, facial recognition, so you can't have a friend blow into the device. Attempts at tampering are reported and dealt with either by the probation department or the judge who's supervising the case. Reports are generated each month. They're rather costly. It costs between $100 and $250 to install such a device, and about $65 to $90 a month to maintain the device. And people say, oh my gosh, that's too expensive, they can't afford it. The average blood alcohol content of people arrested for DWI in the United States is 0.18%. A 180-pound man needs 8 drinks to get to a 0.18. Say the average cost of a drink is $5. So $5 times 8 drinks twice a month pays for the device. And since they're not going to be drinking anyway, they're actually going to save money with that device in place. Who monitors the device is something that has to be decided ahead of time. Is it going to be probation? Who's going to get these reports? How quickly will you be able to respond? Because we know the faster you can respond to a breach of conditions of probation, the more likely you are to change the behavior that you want to see changed. I was in a car with a person who had such a device, and we're driving along very merrily, and all of a sudden this noise sounds, and he pulled to the side of the road and had to blow into the device again. I said, what's up with that? He said, oh, it does that every so often to make sure that the same person is driving. So that's another one of those safeguards that they've put in. Another thing is, instead of just blowing, you kind of have to make this humming noise. And the machine can recognize your voice and say, yes, it's you. So the very early ones were pretty unsophisticated, and now they're pretty doggone sophisticated. So when they sense the alcohol, they lock you out, and you're unable to start the car. The largest number of lockouts, I bet you could guess, is on Saturday night. The smallest number of lockouts is on Tuesday morning. Monday morning, they're still kind of drunk from the weekend if they've been out carousing. But by Tuesday morning, most of the alcohol's out of their system. If you ask people about the device, and they have asked the consumers, most of the defendants will say they're embarrassed by having to have it in the car. And most of the families will say they're grateful that their loved one has it in the car. Something that's being worked on right now is it's really going to be standard equipment in cars within about 5 years. You know how all the new cars have the starter button with you just use your thumb to start it? Well, that's going to be an alcohol sensing device, or it'll be into the wheel, so that your body is constantly trying to get rid of that alcohol, so the transdermal sensors will be there, and if it registered, it won't be able to start. Another thing you can use the ignition interlock device for is probation can set up a random phone call system where you get a call and say, go out to the car and try to start it. That's to stop the person who is home for the evening and is not going to drive, but is going to drink. So there's also portable devices that aren't connected to a car, portable breath machines, where you can do the same thing, these random calls where you have to blow into the device and see whether or not any alcohol registers. A fairly new program is called 24/7. It started in South Dakota, has spread to North Dakota, Montana, a couple of the other states up there. And essentially what it is, you are required as a condition of being released, in any case where alcohol is involved, to go into the local police station twice a day and get breath tested. And you pay $2 for that test. So once before work, once after work, twice a day. If you register alcohol, you're escorted down the hall and into a cell because you're found in violation of your probation right then and there. So it is instant feedback, which we know from behavior modification. The faster you can get the feedback, the more likely you are to change the behavior. So that's a good thing. In South Dakota, where it was studied, they found a 93% compliance rate. People who were tested twice a day were testing clean, which is pretty amazing. And a 98% completion rate. Now, if you don't live in an area where you can easily get to a police station to go and take the test, you can use a device like SCRAM, which is a transdermal continuing alcohol monitoring system. So you have this wrist, you can put it on your wrist, you can put it on your ankle, and it's a transdermal sensor, so it can tell whether or not you're drinking alcohol and whether it's being secreted out of your pores. Again, reports are generated. You can have a very quick response for the person if they do decide to drink. They found out that people were doing things like taking pieces of bologna and putting it between the device and the ankle of the individual who's supposed to be wearing it in an attempt to make the machine not know they were drinking. That didn't work so well. But there's lots of attempts at first because they're looking for a way to beat it. But as the treatment kicks in, as the reality of they're going to have to do this thing kicks in, then those tamper attempts sort of peter off. The other way to test for alcohol is through blood tests. That's very invasive, as you know. There's a fairly new Supreme Court case that requires a warrant to get a blood test on somebody who's been driving if they do not wish to submit to a blood test. There's 2 cases in front of the Supreme Court this session having to do with whether or not you can be punished for failure to take a test. And essentially the theory goes, I cannot be required to give evidence against myself, so if you're requiring me to take a blood or breath test under implied consent law, that's violating my constitutional rights. So it'll be very interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with these 2 cases. Finally, urine can be tested. Nobody likes to deal with urine. It's invasive. In the old days, when urine was still allowed in California, you'd get a case and there'd be in the evidence envelope, and we'd have to bag it separately and tell jurors not to try to take the top off. Here you are dealing with urine and nobody really wants to do that. And finally, there's a chemical test that tests enzymes in your liver, the alpha hydrogenase, which is what processes the alcohol, called ETS and ETG. So that's another way to see if you've been drinking alcohol, because these enzymes should not be present unless they've had to process. So we've become pretty darn sophisticated in how we can keep track of who's drinking, who's using other drugs. And the idea is not so much to catch people and punish them. The idea is to say, how can we help this person come to terms with the problem that's keeping them involved in the criminal justice system? Is treatment working? Have we given the support that we need to? Is there a lack of childcare? Is that why the person isn't going to their classes or going to their groups? It really is a holistic approach to say, how can we give the support to this person to tackle that problem so we don't see them in court again?